Okay, so we're going to be looking at the blood vessels, which are part of the cardiovascular system. And so this is chapter 19. So I'm going to be looking to cover the beginning part of this lecture. So this is like part 1, part 2 we will do in class on Friday, and if we need to finish up on next Wednesday, we will. So when we look at blood vessels, there's different types of blood vessels. There are 3 different types: arteries, capillaries, and veins. And it depends on whether they're moving away from the heart or back to the heart, and whether they're arteries or veins. So arteries are going to be away from the heart. And so we do want to keep in mind that it depends on what circuit we're talking about, whether it's the systemic or whether it's pulmonary, whether it's going to be oxygen rich or oxygen poor. So we can't make an assumption that just because it's an artery that it's going to be a certain state of oxygen. Okay. And then capillaries are going to be found in the tissues, and so this is where we're going to be getting the releasing of oxygen, so the tissue gets oxygen, and then picking up any kind of byproducts that are formed, like carbon dioxide and whatnot, so it's flushed out. And then the veins are going to return back to the heart, and so again, we don't want to make the assumption that all veins are oxygen poor, because when we look at the pulmonary circuit, this would actually be oxygen rich because it's going back to the heart, but it was just at the lung. So if we look at this figure, starting at the heart, as we move down through those red blood vessels, which is our arteries, one of the things you'll notice is that we have different types of arteries, and so you'll see the elastic arteries. So these ones have a more stretch to them, and this allows them to deal with the pressure that is exerted when the heart contracts and the blood forcefully is moved into the arteries. And so they need to be able to withstand high amounts of pressure. And so these are sometimes called pressure reserves. Okay, as we move further away, these arteries are going to get smaller. The muscle layer is going to be more defined, so it's going to have a thicker layer of smooth muscle. So the muscular arteries or distributing arteries allow for the blood to be distributed to the different organs in different systems as needed, depending upon whether we're in like a fight to flight or whether we're in a digesting mode. Okay, so those muscles can kind of shunt and distribute the blood to where it needs to be. Arterioles are going to be even smaller, so this slows the blood down, and so sometimes these are called resistant vesicles. And the whole idea is that before we enter into the capillary, where we're in the terminal arteriole, that we're actually making it so that one blood cell at a time will move through that capillary. So you can see the capillary bed there, exchange vessels, is where we're going to have gas exchange and exchange of ions to the tissues. And so in order for that to happen, the blood has to be slowed down. So we'll be looking at blood flow later on. As it exits the capillary, it's going to go into the postcapillary venule, and then it's going to move up into small veins. So these are larger than the postcapillary, so they have more capacity. And then with the large veins, these are going to be quite large, and that's going to be allowing the blood flow back into the heart. Okay. So one of the things also to keep in mind with the venous system, it's working against gravity. So when we look at this, we're going to notice some special features that allow for that blood flow to go up to the heart, especially if we're talking about the lower extremities. And this is really against the flow of gravity. The other feature you'll notice on this figure is that we have the lymphatic system in here, so that green structure. So the lymphatic system interacts with the blood vessels, so it's going to be found in areas where we've got the capillaries, and so in the site of capillaries, because capillaries are a little leaky, you're going to have fluid coming out. That fluid gets taken back up through the lymphatic system, and so this fluid's known as lymph. As it moves through the lymphatic system, it'll traffic through lymph nodes. Lymph nodes allow for immune cells to sample that lymph, that fluid, for any kind of pathogens or damaged tissue, so that the immune system then can respond. But all of that returns back in before the blood is going back to the heart, so that we maintain a blood volume, and that allows us to maintain blood pressure and blood flow, and all that we will be talking about later on in the second part of the lecture for blood vessels. And we'll be talking more about the lymphatic and the immune system for our second unit, so after our first exam. So when we look at blood vessels, we want to, if we start at the lumen, if we start at the middle, that's where the blood is actually going to be flowing through. And then as we move out through the wall, both arteries and veins have 3 layers. So these layers known as tunicas, tunica intima, tunica media, and tunica externa. And so intima is going to be intimate with the blood. So this is going to be the closest one to the lumen. Media is going to be in the middle. So this is where we're going to see smooth muscle. And then externa is where we're going to be having collagen fibers, and that's going to allow to maintain the structure of the blood vessel. Okay. And then capillaries, they're going to be made up of endothelial cells, and then they have a basal lamina. So this figure from the textbook, figure 19.2, shows you those different structures and those different layers. So again, as you can see, we have the tunica intima. Endothelial cells are going to line the blood vessel, and so that we have that blood being maintained in there. These endothelial cells are closely connected together so that you're not getting any blood loss through the blood vessel. So, and it's in the capillary where we actually have some spacing between the endothelial cells. So we have these clefts that are formed, so that allows for gas exchange through there and ions to be exchanged. And then we're going to look at different types of capillaries, but in some cases, if there are larger holes or fenestrations or synoids, it will allow for larger materials, larger molecules, or even cells to move through that capillary. And it all depends on what organ the capillary is found in, but we'll be talking about those shortly. In this figure, you can see with the tunica media, in our artery here, that has a much thicker tunica media, and that's because we need to be able to control the flow. And so this would be most likely, it looks like it'd be like a muscular artery, because it's got that thick tunica media made up of the smooth muscle, allowing for control of the flow to different areas. And then on the externa, you can see that it's got this collagen fiber, and so again, it's just meant to kind of insulate, to give the shape to the blood vessel. So as you're looking at the different types of blood vessels, we've already mentioned that there's elastic, muscular, and arterial. So we can look at these different layers and the type of tissue that's making up the layers, and we can see that they have a different ratio for them of how much is there. Also, one of the features you'll notice is that the diameter changes. So the diameter is going to be largest at the elastic artery, where it's closest to the heart, because we need to get the blood away from that. Okay. And then we're going into smaller as we get closer to those capillary beds. And again, one of the things I'd point out here is that change in the smooth muscle. And again, the muscular artery is going to have the highest amount of smooth muscle. And in this table, we're looking at our veins. There's a capillary on there, and so you can see with the large vein at the bottom, diameter much larger. Venules are going to be much smaller because they're closest to the capillary. And with the capillary, you can see that they're just made up of the endothelial cells. They don't have the elastic tissue, smooth muscle, or any of the collagen fibers. Right, so as I mentioned with the elastic arteries, sometimes these are called conducting arteries because they're going to conduct and move the blood away from the heart. So these are going to be the largest of the arteries, so they're going to have a very large lumen. This means that the blood can move through without any resistance. So as you move down and you're going to have smaller arteries, that's where you're going to see the diameter getting smaller. So there's a higher resistance, so that slows the flow down. And that's important for their feature and their function. For the elastic arteries, it's just get the blood away and don't rupture. So that's where the elastin is really important, so that it has a stretch to it, so that it can expand as the force of the blood is coming into them, and they don't rupture. As we mentioned with the muscular arteries, these are known as distributing arteries, so they're going to just deliver the blood to the different organs so that they're receiving the blood to their capillaries. Okay, and it's that tunica media that's going to be the thickest because it's going to have more smooth muscle because it needs to be able to constrict and dilate, because that's how it's going to control the flow of blood to the different organs. So if it constricts, think of like a boa constrictor constricting around its prey, it gets smaller, so you're going to get contraction of that smooth muscle involuntarily, so we don't have to think about this, right? Our blood flows to where it needs to, because the smooth muscle is going to be controlled by our nervous system, and we don't have to be consciously thinking, oh geez, I just ate, I need to shunt more blood over to my intestines. So this action of constriction and dilation occurs without us being aware of it. So the arterial, these are the smallest arteries, and so they're going to lead directly into the capillary bed, and so they're going to help control that flow and really make sure that we're slowing down the blood flow, so they're able to undergo constriction and dilation also. Okay, and then so for capillaries, these are going to be the smallest blood vessels, and so they just have an endothelial layer. So it's only the tunica interna, or intima, and so it's a single cell layer, so a single cell layer of endothelial cells, and then we have like a basal lamina holding that together, okay, so that it doesn't fall apart. So it is the blood vessel small enough that a single red blood cell is going to pass through, and so as that single red blood cell is moving through the capillary, it is able to deliver oxygen, and at the same time any kind of byproducts are able to be picked up into the blood. Okay. There's a cells called pericytes. These are on the outside, and they just help to stabilize the wall of it, and we'll see that in a couple. I'll pull them out in the next couple of figures, because we're going to be looking at the three different types of capillaries. So we have continuous. So continuous are going to allow for ions to move through and molecules like oxygen. So these are going to be found in the skin and muscles, and we'll be looking at those just in a moment. And then we have fenestrated. Fenestrated actually have little holes or fenestrations in there. So this is going to allow for larger molecules like proteins to move across. And then lastly, we have synoids. And synoid capillaries are actually going to have very large holes in them in the endothelial cells, and that's going to allow for even cells to move through. So with fenestrated, because we are going to have larger molecules move through, these are found in the kidney, so really important for the production of urine. For synoids, we were going to want cells moving through, so for the bone marrow and different lymphatic tissues, this is going to be important because the immune cells need to be able to move out of the bone marrow, and then they need to be able to move freely in the lymphatic organs. So next we're going to be, the next three slides are figures that are showing the different capillaries. So we'll look at those. So for the continuous capillary, as I mentioned, this is where the endothelial cells are going to be close together, but there's going to be a little bit of space, so you can see how there's these clefts that are formed, intercellular clefts. So this is the space that allows for the oxygen or other ions to move in and out of this capillary. So as you can see, that red blood cell is moving through, and it's just fitting through. Another thing you want to look at is that pericyte. So just a cell that's going to be around the outside of the capillary. These have these kind of like feet, so we're going to see similar structure, similar cells when we look at the kidney and the urinary system. And so they kind of have these podium, so this is like so that you can actually get those ions moving in between them. So they're not interfering with any kind of gas exchange that's going to occur, but it just gives a little added structure so that basement membrane or basal lamina isn't the only thing holding together your capillary. So then with our fenestrated capillary, as I mentioned, is found like in the kidney because of production of urine and having to make sure that waste products are being shed into the urine, but also in the small intestine because we need to move molecules in so our cells can absorb it. What you'll notice is that we have these fenestrations or pores, these holes that are present in the endothelial cells. So this is where we're going to have that movement through. Again, we see that the red blood is just big enough for a red blood cell to fit through. So lastly, our synoid capillary. So this is where we're going to have the highest amount of permeability. And so in the bone marrow, the spleen is a lymphatic organ. So we're going to want to make sure cells are moving through there, and also like the liver, because that's where we're going to process old red blood cells. So we're going to need those to come out of the blood so that they can be processed, pieces reused and recycled. Okay. So again, you'll notice these large, the thing you should be noting here is these large holes that are found in these endothelial cells, and also quite a bit of space in that cleft in between the cells. So the intercellular cleft is much more pronounced and large in synoid versus continuous. So these capillaries come together to form capillary beds, and so there is like a microcirculation that occurs in this network, and so it's important that they're able to shunt or move the blood flow where they need to. So there's actually going to be these muscular shunts that allow for movement to go directly through the capillary beds, or so that flow can really feed the whole entire bed. So here we see the shunt working, and so in the top one, all of these vascular shunts or sphincters are open, so this allows blood flow through the whole entire true capillary, this network that's formed. In figure B, panel B, you can see how these shunts are closed, and so we're not going to get blood flow through the whole entire capillary. It's just going to bypass the capillary bed and just move through a single capillary. So with our venous system, right, then as we then exit that capillary bed, those capillaries are going to come together, kind of fuse together, unite to form the venous system, the venules. So we have our postcapillary venules. So these can be the smallest ones, and so they'll have a layer of endothelial cells, basement membrane, and then a few of the pericytes. Then those will feed into larger venules. So this will actually have some smooth muscle. So we'll have a tunica intima, tunica interna, whichever term you're using, and then a middle layer, the tunica media. And so again, the media layer is made up of the smooth muscle. So then as the venules come together, when they converge, this is going to form your veins. Okay, so first your small veins and then your large veins. So for your veins, they're going to have the three layers that we previously saw. So 3 tunicas. You're going to have your tunica intima with your endothelial cells, but then you're going to have a thin tunica media. So you'll notice this when we look at a slide of the vein and an artery. And then you're going to have a thick tunica externa. So tunica externa is going to have the collagen and elastin fibers. So keep in mind the function of the veins. So they're meant to be holding the blood and transporting the blood back. And so it's not that they're regulating where the blood flow is going. And so having a thin tunica media is just fine because you don't need to have that muscle control. You're a vesicle to bring back that blood reserve. And so that's where the tunica externa is important so that you can have that capacity to hold a larger blood volume. Okay. And so when we look at the blood reserve, when we look at the veins, 65% of the blood supply is in veins in any given point. And so the majority of your blood supply is in the venous system. So because the function of the veins is returning to the heart, there's not a lot of pressure. So the pressure in blood is due to the volume, but also due to the force that the blood is being moved, pumped out of the heart. So the pressure is going to be highest in the arteries. So it's going to be the lowest in the vein because we're the furthest away from the heart, the pumping, the ventricles. So they're going to have a thinner wall than the arteries because they don't have that pressure that they need to withstand. They do have to get over, in lower extremities, over the force of gravity, which may not seem like a lot, but it needs assistance in order to return the blood to the heart. So there's a couple special features, adaptations that veins have. So one of the things they're going to have is these large lumen. So again, when we look at these, you'll notice how large the lumens are compared to your arteries. And because of the larger lumen, it's going to offer less resistance to flow so that you're not having to deal with like friction from the blood moving through. So this is similar to like what we see in the elastic arteries. The elastic arteries are larger because they're close to the heart, and so we want to make sure we're flowing the blood out of the heart for the elastic arteries. So they're going to have a larger lumen. Well, the veins are going to have larger lumens because we don't want that resistance as the blood is slowly moving back. Okay. We also have these valves. The valves look similar to semilunar valves, and so just like the semilunar valves the cups will actually come together and kind of close the valve, and that prevents backflow in the heart. The valves in the vein do the same thing. So the valves will actually hold, will close, and that prevents any backflow down the vein, so we're always moving in a forward direction. So the valves actually kind of work like a cup. So if you've ever been to the Saugus water wheel, you'll notice that there's like a cup on the water wheel. It holds the water moves up in the cup, and then it comes down. And there's a series of cups moving the water up. And so these valves don't move in your veins, but they act as a cup holding it until the next volume of blood comes through and moves that blood up to the next segment that has valves. There's also venous sinuses, and so these are kind of flattened vesicles that have really thin walls, so they're actually able to kind of act like a holding reservoir, so you can store a little bit, you have more blood present there, and so the more blood, it again is able then to move up through the veins back to the heart. Right, and so here we have a slide of an artery and a vein, and so you should be able to tell the difference between them even if they weren't labeled. So on our left we have our artery, and you'll notice that down towards the bottom there's a nice pink area that's showing up. This is actually found throughout, it's just a little more pronounced down there towards the bottom, so it's easier to see, but this is our tunica intima. And so this is going to be the endothelial cells that are lining that lumen where the blood would be flowing through. The darker color, which is like a dark purple, that is going to be the tunica media, so where we have our smooth muscle. So this is more pronounced in an artery because that's going to be thicker, because we want to be able to constrict or dilate, so we can change the diameter of the artery, so we can control where blood is flowing. And then last layer, the tunica externa, is that kind of lighter pink color on the outside. So that's where our collagen fibers are going to be found. One of the things you'll notice is with the arteries that this has a nice kind of round shape to it. Now when we look at our vein is all kind of collapsed in, so it just doesn't have the same kind of look to it. If we were actually to open that vein up, we would actually notice that the lumen there is actually larger than that artery, because it's collapsed in. It's a little difficult to see that. Now with the vein, there is a tunica intima. We don't have any areas that we can really see that staining, but we would have a layer of endothelial cells. Then we have that darker color, the purple, that you'll notice that's really thin. So that's our tunica media, our smooth muscle. And then the most prominent layer is the tunica externa, where we have our collagen or our elastin fibers. So that's just going to allow the vein to be able to hold a larger volume, more blood. Right, so this concludes the audio lecture for part 1 of Blood Vessels, chapter 19. On our part 2, our next lecture is going to be looking at blood flow, blood pressure, and then how do we regulate that, both short-term and long-term.